Hi there, I'm Jessie Cook and welcome back to SciDance on YouTube. Today we're looking at episode 4 from the podcast, which is with Matt Lamarque on training loads. What do we mean when we talk about training loads? So training loads typically refers to the physical stress applied to an athlete or dancer. There is also a psychological aspect, but Matt's more involved in monitoring the physical side. So that's like the mechanical work that the athlete or the dancer is doing, but there's also a side to it that's the physiological changes happening in their body. There are 4 ways that training loads can be monitored, so we'll start with internally or externally. Externally means the mechanical work, so in ballet this might be the amount of jumps that they do. Internally refers to internal response, so things like breathing rate. There's also objective or subjective training loads. So objective would be things like heart rate, whereas subjective is more about the athlete's perception, so that might be something like rate of perceived exertion. When Matt refers to training loads, we're talking about for a given session, so usually this is worked out by the volume of the session multiplied by the intensity. We can then quantify this to look at a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's important to look at training loads in dance because there are a lot of unknowns at the moment. Dance doesn't have the same funding, so Matt thinks it's maybe a few years behind where it could be compared to sports science. Training loads as an area, though, is quite easily accessible and it can tell us a lot about the population that we're working with. So Matt talks about a cycle that we need to break. High training loads causes a higher risk of injury. In ballet, we know that there's a high risk of injury and there's also high training loads, so it's quite a repetitive cycle for injuries with this workload. There's research that suggests that adolescent dancers may have a 76% chance of having an injury during an academic year. Some research suggests that this might be up to 82%. These are really high numbers, and when we break this down, about 80% of these injuries tend to be overuse, so we have to ask ourselves why this is. Adolescents may be doing up to 30 hours of dance per week, with professionals doing up to 50. So for 35 to 40 weeks in a season, this really adds up. When we look into the intensity though, the research suggests that dancers maybe aren't doing that much from a physiological point of view. Research suggests that about 40% of periods in classical ballet were at a moderate intensity, with 10% at high intensity and only 5% at a very high intensity. When we think about technical teaching, this makes sense because there's often rests in work. Ballet is very intermittent and very stop-start. So even though we're training long hours, ballet doesn't seem that physiologically intense. However, from a mechanical point of view, landing forces in smaller jumps may range between 3 to 10 times the dancer's body weight. This might be why these overuse injuries start to build up. Matt recorded class and tracked these jumps in the Royal Ballet School from both a single leg and a double leg point of view. In just a 10 to 15 minute allegro portion of the class, the dancers were jumping between 150 to 300 times. So this shows us why training loads is so important to consider for overuse injury risk. But as well as injury risk, there's also a performance enhancement side to this. To enhance performance in terms of training load, recovery might be just as important as the work that we're doing. For example, there's a tendency to increase rehearsals prior to a performance. This is natural, but it might mean that our dancers are actually just more fatigued, so their capacity to be the best that they can be is actually reduced. So looking back at the work at the Royal Ballet School, the dancers filled out a perceptual well-being form each morning. This gave perceptual data like energy levels and sleep, but to get some objective data, all the dancers on Monday mornings now do 1 maximal jump on a forced platform. This can show their jump height, any asymmetries, and also their landing mechanics. So looking at this over a 6-month period, the kids, when they were fresh from a holiday, jumped the highest, and then this decreased over the term. The lowest jumps were actually seen in the 3 weeks of their shows, so this suggests that maybe our dancers aren't at their best when we need them to be. Teacher education is really key, so Matt tracked the dancers' rate of perceived exertion for these classes, and also the teacher's intention for this. Sometimes these correlated, but sometimes they didn't, so Matt's advice would be to be aware of what you're asking and why that is. Engaging in dialogue for why we want certain things is really important. It can be hard to remove yourself and to criticise why and what we're doing, so it's really important to plan ahead what you're working towards and to be open with this. Periodisation can really help us with mapping training loads, so you can check out the episode on the full podcast on periodisation with Kim Hutt. Another really big point for dance educators is to be aware of different students. So the teacher might set 30 jumps in a class. Some students will just do this, the bare minimum that's asked, and then get water in the breaks. Some students will do this and then mark it at the back and maybe do a few extra jumps. And some students will dance with every group and maybe do this 3 times over. So it's about being aware of the students that do more than they need to do and planning our training loads according to that as well. Benefits from monitoring training load include reduced injury risk, enhanced performance, enhanced student well-being, and being more mindful of their general well-being. and also more physically and mentally engaged students. Matt's advice to teachers is that something is better than nothing, so it doesn't need to be everything, just take note of and engage in how your students are feeling that day. Often students might not tell the teachers how they feel though, because the teacher is seen as the role model, so building trust with students is really important. It's about being open and encouraging communication, and being consistent with looking at our training loads over a season is when the benefits will show. Positive change is happening in dance culture, and training loads is another one of these areas that we can improve. It's not about pointing the finger, but about working with each other on how we can make our dancers' training better. Small change is good and adds up. So for example, at the Royal Ballet School, Matt talks about how they reduced their training load by half an hour each day. This might not seem like much, but adds up over a year. The injury rates have decreased year on year, and whilst it may not be directly linked to this, it might be because the dancers are less fatigued generally, they have more time to themselves. It's important to recognise that whilst the environment is traditional, as teachers, if we're involved with this change, this can be for the greater good. Being able to teach more students is positive. It's what we want as teachers. We want students in the studios. So by working towards looking at our training loads in a scientific way, we can have this. Matt talks a little bit more in the podcast about how teachers now communicate better, so they talk about their training loads and periodisation and when their students should progress. At the end of the day, we're all for the same goal. Matt's biggest take home for a teacher is to be aware of your sessions. Being able to understand, criticise and develop your yearly programme will be the best thing for dancers from both a physical and a psychological point of view. Thanks so much for watching, and tune in again soon for another episode of SciDance on YouTube. Make sure you check out the full episode, which I'll link down below. You can watch it on Apple or listen to it on Apple, Spotify and most other major podcast platforms. Bye!